talk today will be delivered by Dr. Katherine Starzyk, Iloradanon Efimoff, and Aleah Fontaine, all of whom are from the Department of Psychology here at the University of Manitoba. The talk is entitled "The Canadian Reconciliation Barometer, our 2021 report highlights." And some of you have maybe seen some of the media coverage of this great research in the last few days, and we're really delighted to have them here today to present in our series.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Coop. We're excited to be here today to talk about the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer. Since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its reports and the 94 calls to action, reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada has become a topic of interest for many people, ranging from individuals to government. There are literally hundreds or more of initiatives across the country that are intended to help us move toward reconciliation. But what is reconciliation, and can we measure our progress towards it? In 2015, a small group of like-minded researchers, including principal investigator Katherine Starzyk, who is here with us today, Rai Moran, who was then the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and Dean Peachy, who is now retired from the Global College at the University of Winnipeg, came together to discuss whether and how to measure reconciliation. This group has grown over the years and is truly interdisciplinary, including collaborators in psychology, peace and conflict studies, political studies, Indigenous studies, law, and public polling. We work with multiple organizations, including the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the Universities of Manitoba, Winnipeg, and Victoria, and Probe Research Incorporated. Together, we started on a path toward measuring reconciliation, and we have four main objectives that frame this work. First, we want to understand what reconciliation means to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada on an ongoing and evolving basis. Second, we want to respectfully track reconciliation progress using best practices in psychometrics, which is the scientific study of measurement, and public polling. Third, we want to evaluate interventions and initiatives that are aimed at promoting reconciliation. And fourth, we think that it's important that this work informs policy related to reconciliation, including developing recommendations on ongoing interventions that may be necessary. And we've worked towards these goals using a multi-phased approach. So we've gone through this work in three phases. We started by going to who we thought were the best experts on reconciliation, residential school survivors. Survivors launched a class action lawsuit in response to the crimes against humanity they experienced in residential schools. As part of a settlement agreement with the Canadian government, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established and gathered thousands of statements from survivors. Their testimony is now housed at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where we were able to access this testimony for our work. Our team was one of the first to access survivor statements for this research. It was a really kind of exciting opportunity to look at these statements. We focused on survivors' responses to the question, what does reconciliation mean to you? In starting with survivor statements, we endeavored to ground this work in the lived experiences of residential school survivors to ensure that our work honored these experiences. To do this work, we randomly sampled 100 of the survivors' responses to the question I just said, what does reconciliation mean to you? To ensure we had accurate demographic representation of the survivors, we used gender quotas and also identity quotas for First Nations, Métis, and Inuk survivors. We coded this data using InVivo, which is a qualitative analysis software, and we had 3 separate people code this data. We then thematically analyzed survivor responses to this question to identify recurring themes that survivors thought made up reconciliation. We don't have time to dive into these kind of really rich and complex findings, but we grounded all of our future work in them and feel that our barometer well represents survivors' conceptions of reconciliation. Working closely with Rai Moran, then director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, also helped us to ensure the development of the barometer aligned with survivor experiences. We plan to write a manuscript based on this work in the future. Phase 2 and 3 overlapped with one another. In phase 2, we conducted interviews and focus groups with reconciliation leaders across the country. To us, reconciliation leaders were people who dedicated themselves to reconciliation and were recognized for their knowledge and contributions in various organizations in many different sectors of society. The people we interviewed and included in our focus groups varied in age, gender, and lived experiences. And we did host Indigenous and non-Indigenous focus groups separately. We conducted focus groups in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, represented by the green dots on the screen. We were unfortunately not able to get everywhere that we wanted to go, and notably absent from this phase of our data collection are the North, Quebec, and Ontario, which are represented by the beige dots on the map of Canada. We're really grateful to the hosts in those local communities who helped us to coordinate these meetings. And again, we don't have time to dive into these really interesting findings from this large project containing 13 focus groups and 4 interviews. But we identified several themes within this data that informed our thinking about reconciliation. Notable themes included the importance of education, the need to address systemic inequities, and the lack of trust and good relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We again plan to write a manuscript based on this work to share these results more broadly. In the third and final phase, we reviewed international reconciliation barometers to see how others around the world were measuring reconciliation. There are dozens of reconciliation barometers internationally, and we reviewed those from countries such as South Africa, Australia, and Rwanda. Reviewing these barometers gave us insight into how others had measured reconciliation and helped to inform the types of questions we plan to ask in our barometer. We developed the items for our barometer using best psychometric practices. Now again, psychometrics is the scientific study of measurement. Effectively, we wanted to ensure that our items reliably measured what we thought they were measuring. Psychometrics is an entire field unto itself, so we don't have time to delve into the mysteries of measurement design today, but suffice to say, creating a psychometrically sound scale is a large undertaking with many different considerations. We developed several indicators of reconciliation. Aleah will talk more about these next, but for now, I'll note that in line with psychometric best practices, we included multiple items or questions for each indicator. These items or questions were typically statements that we asked participants to agree or disagree with using a 1 to 5 scale. Our questions were about perceptions of progress toward reconciliation. So we asked people how much they agreed or disagreed that, for example, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people had equal educational outcomes, or that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people trusted one another. We also ensured our items were strength-based. Specifically, we avoided asking any questions that might reinforce stereotypes about Indigenous people. For example, instead of asking participants to agree or disagree with the statement that Indigenous people have worse health outcomes than non-Indigenous people, we asked for participants to agree or disagree with the statement that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada have equal health outcomes. We also ensured that our questions measured the presence of something positive, such as good relations, rather than simply the absence of something negative, such as racism. After spending months drafting these items, we launched our first national poll, obtaining 1,575 participants, 582 of whom were Indigenous and 994 of whom were non-Indigenous. We next refined these items based on psychometric best practices and launched a second national poll, obtaining 1,650 participants, 537 of whom were Indigenous and 1,112 of whom were non-Indigenous. We used quotas and weighting to ensure both polls were nationally representative and thus included participants in Canada from all walks of life. Quotas are a fixed number of participants in a variety of different categories that we wanted to obtain. We had quotas for region, gender, age, education, ethnicity, and a couple other variables as well. Weighting is a statistical technique to make certain groups count for more within a sample, and we only applied weights when we were unable to reach our quotas. Both quotas and weighting are really common procedures in national polling. Now that you have an understanding of how we created the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer, Aleah is going to take you through the indicators that made up that barometer.
Thank you, Iloradanon. Now I'm going to spend some time describing what our indicators of reconciliation are. Though reconciliation means different things to different people, there were several themes that people commonly mentioned in their testimony to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, in focus groups, and in interviews. In our review and analysis, we identified 13 of these common themes or indicators and wrote several statements to represent each indicator. Our first indicator was good understanding of the past and present. Many survivors and participants spoke about the importance of education and truth-telling for advancing reconciliation. So for this indicator, respondents rated the extent to which they felt they personally had a good understanding of Indigenous peoples' past and present experiences and challenges. Our second indicator was acknowledgement of government harm. Now, an acknowledgement is an important first step toward reconciliation progress. So our respondents reported the extent to which they agreed that governments in Canada have hurt Indigenous peoples, done things to weaken Indigenous cultures, that this harm has been purposeful, and that governments have been slow to change these harmful policies. Our third indicator, which Katherine is going to discuss in more detail a little later on, is acknowledgement of residential school harm. Now, in reviewing residential school survivors' testimony to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, survivors spoke about how crucial it was that people in Canada acknowledged the truth of what happened in residential schools. Respondents reported how much they agreed that the residential school system was a bad idea, that it was one of the many ways governments have hurt Indigenous peoples, that the priests, nuns, and other staff abused the children there, and that one goal of the system was to get rid of Indigenous cultures. Our fourth indicator, which is closely tied to the last few, was acknowledgement of ongoing harm. So not only is it important for people in Canada to understand history, people must see how the past is linked to and continues to affect the present. So respondents rated how much they agreed that past harmful actions continue to affect Indigenous peoples psychologically, physically, spiritually, and across many generations. Our fifth indicator was engagement. So part of reconciliation involves being engaged and connected with Indigenous peoples, communities, and cultures, and standing with and supporting their causes. So participants reported the extent to which they were personally engaged with Indigenous causes and communities. Our sixth indicator, which Katherine is also going to discuss more later, was mutually respectful relationships. Though many have spoken about the importance of addressing harms like racism and discrimination, we thought that aiming for the absence of harm was a low bar to reach. We wanted to measure something more, something that we wanted to see rather than not see, and landed on the presence of positive interpersonal relationships. We heard from survivors and focus group participants about how important it is to build bridges and strong relationships, and how lack of these respectful relationships contributes to racism and discrimination. For this indicator, Respondents rated how much they felt Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have relationships with one another that they value and that are characterized by mutual personal and cultural respect, interpersonal trust, and comfort. Our seventh indicator was nation-to-nation relationships. This was another theme that people commonly talk about. Respondents rated the extent to which they believed Indigenous nations were in a true nation-to-nation relationship with governments in Canada, where Indigenous nations' rights are honored and respected, and they have the resources that they need, like land and financial needs, to achieve their goals. Our eighth indicator, which is an especially important one that Katherine will again talk more on later, was personal equality. For reconciliation to occur, it's important that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people enjoy the same good life outcomes. Respondents told us the extent to which they think that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have equal physical and mental health outcomes, educational outcomes, job and promotion opportunities, and financial security. Our ninth indicator was systemic equality. Now, this is closely linked to personal equality because systemic factors can strongly influence personal outcomes. Respondents told us the extent to which they think that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are treated fairly in social systems. So we asked about several different sectors, including the arts, sports, education, workplaces, the healthcare system, media, and the child welfare and criminal justice systems. Also closely tied to systemic equality was our 10th indicator, representation and leadership. So respondents told us the extent that they thought Indigenous people were represented as decision makers or leaders within places like government, as well as all of those sectors that I just mentioned. Our 11th indicator was Indigenous thriving. Another common theme that people speak about is the importance of healing from the trauma that governments and others in Canada have inflicted upon Indigenous people. So in keeping with our strength-based perspective, we wanted to measure the presence of health rather than simply the absence of illness, hence why we call this indicator Indigenous thriving. Respondents rated the extent to which they felt that Indigenous cultures, families, youth, and languages were doing well. Our 12th indicator was respect for the natural world. In gathering testimony from survivors, commissioners reported that they repeatedly heard about how important it was that we also reconcile with the broader natural world. Respondents rated the extent that they felt people of all ages, political beliefs, the federal government, and resource extraction industries were acting so that the natural world could be healthy now as well as into the future. Our 13th and final indicator was apologies. Though the federal government and some groups have given apologies, not all who have caused harm have done this. Respondents rated the extent that they felt groups who have harmed Indigenous peoples have acknowledged the hurt that they caused, accepted responsibility for their actions, shown remorse, and provided sincere apologies. So together, these are 13 important indicators or markers of progress toward reconciliation that our team identified. Reconciliation is multifaceted, and our understanding of it is always growing and changing. As time goes on, we expect our list of indicators will grow and change as well. Now I'm going to turn it over to Katherine, who's going to spend some time discussing what we found in our national polls.
Thanks, Aleah and Iloradanon. Now I'll speak about some of our findings. We don't have the time to cover everything, so please see the report at reconciliationbarometer.ca for more information. Today, I'll focus on the national level findings by ethnicity across all our indicators, and then take a deeper look at a few. So before I walk you through what we found, I just want to orient you to what the graphs will look like. So you'll soon see the 13 indicators listed near the horizontal axis here. in order from highest to lowest average amongst Indigenous respondents. So our highest average was for residential school harm. And this horizontal midline here also represents that neither agree nor disagree response option on the 5-point rating scale that accompanied each statement. What we did is we assigned that value of 0. And so the possible range of the scores could be from -1, which represents strongly disagree, to 1, which represents strongly agree. The other thing you want to keep in mind is what the colors of the bars mean. So the navy bars represent the non-Indigenous average response. And then those, what looks to me like a teal bar, represents the average Indigenous response. And one of the keys to think about is that if a bar is above 0 or this midline, as both are for residential school harm, this means that respondents agreed with the statements. And if it's below, then it means that they disagreed on average. Another thing that you want to pay attention to are the whiskers on the bars. Some people think of them as capital I's. These represent the 95% confidence intervals for each of the average estimates. And the key for these is that when they don't overlap, the group scores differ significantly. When they do overlap, the responses are similar across groups. So in this case, the two don't overlap. And so we can say that Indigenous respondents perceived more residential school harm or acknowledged more residential school harm than did non-Indigenous respondents. Finally, in looking at all these graphs, there are two things we'd like you to keep in mind. One is that in our conception of things, positive scores suggest progress, and similarity in group responses suggest progress. So we have progress in one of these ways for this indicator, but not in the other. Both are above 0, but there is a significant difference between these two. So now you've already seen the data for residential school harm. I'm also going to present to you the other indicators. And so this will look like a lot when you see it, so prepare yourself, but I will walk you through it. So here's what you saw before. That's the data for residential school harm. And so what we'll do is we'll slowly walk from left to right, and I'll give you a sense of what this means. And so what you can see here is that similar to residential school harm, participants also agreed that those past harmful actions continue to negatively affect Indigenous peoples, that governments in Canada have harmed Indigenous peoples, and respondents did think that they have a good understanding of the past and present. Less so, both groups agreed that relationships are mutually respectful. And finally, on the positive end of things, only Indigenous respondents agreed that they engage with and support Indigenous experiences and causes. So that is the good-ish news. Unfortunately, though, Indigenous respondents also disagreed for 7 of the 13 indicators. So that's all the remaining indicators, including apologies, respect for the natural world, Indigenous thriving, systemic equality, representation and leadership, nation-to-nation relationships, and personal equality, with the scores being the lowest for personal equality, and that's a really significant issue. So for all of these indicators, the average for Indigenous respondents, so those teal bars, is significantly lower than this midline, meaning that they did truly disagree. And regarding the consensus or lack of it between the groups, if you look at each pair of bars across all of the indicators, what you can see is that non-Indigenous and Indigenous responses differed significantly for every indicator. And so closing this gap needs to be a focus over time. Today, I'll talk a little bit more about 4 of these indicators. As Aleah said, acknowledgement of residential school harm, mutually respectful relationships, personal equality, and engagement. And I will tell you that we had a really difficult time deciding what to cover in this, but our time is limited, and so this is what we can do. I'll also briefly discuss how proud Indigenous respondents are to be Indigenous. So here is one more detailed set of findings for residential school harm. Now, I'll walk you through this because it's a little bit different than what you saw on the prior graph, and all the other ones will be very similar, so it kind of makes sense to have some setup. So first off, this graph presents the averages for Indigenous and non-Indigenous respondents for the overall score, which is here on the left. And this actually just replicates what you've seen before already in the prior page. And then the items that make up this indicator, we have shortened labels for them here. The results for these specific items are on the right. Now, we feel like these results are always more trustworthy because the results based on multiple indicators are more reliable, but it's also useful to examine these because sometimes we find that there are some interesting differences that we need to pay attention to. So what are the findings here? Essentially, they are that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous respondents agreed that residential schools are one of the ways that governments have hurt Indigenous peoples, that the priests, nuns, and others who worked in residential schools abused the children there, that residential schools are a bad idea, and that a goal of residential schools was to get rid of Indigenous cultures. Within each group, respondents agreed about the same level on these first 3 statements: government role, child abuse in schools, bad idea. But for the fourth group, for the fourth item, non-Indigenous participants were especially less likely to agree that the goal was to destroy cultures. Another story here is that compared to non-Indigenous respondents, Indigenous respondents agreed more with each statement, and these differences are medium in size. To provide a more accessible way to summarize the group averages up here, we also use colored emoticons. Navy emoticons represent the non-Indigenous respondents, and the teal emoticons represent the Indigenous respondents. You can assume that we're doing better when the emoticons are happier and closer together. And so what you see here is that the Indigenous emoticons are happier than the non-Indigenous ones, but that they're separated by what we call a medium-sized difference. Yet another way to think about the results is how frequently respondents endorse the options for the overall score. So we can look at this overall score and break it down into how many times people chose each option on average. And we call this a stacked histogram. And in this stacked histogram, there are different colors that represent the different response options. So the navy represents the strongly agree option, and the teal represents the agree option. And adding these 2 agree categories together, the results indicate that on average, 61% of non-Indigenous respondents, but 82% of Indigenous respondents agreed that residential schools have harmed Indigenous peoples. So this means people in Canada understand and acknowledge past and current harms caused by residential schools, but there's certainly a worrisome gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. So that's a lot to take away, and I'll kind of take the same approach for the next 3 slides, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end about each of these things in case anything is unclear. So for the indicator of mutually respectful relationships, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous respondents somewhat agreed that relationships are mutually respectful, with one exception. Here, for the statement of trusting one another, Indigenous respondent score did not significantly differ from this midpoint. And this was also the lowest score for non-Indigenous respondents. Importantly as well, for all the statements, the Indigenous respondents were less positive than were the non-Indigenous respondents. One thing that if you're, savvy to like the size of the difference in the numbers, you might think that this difference is relatively small, and it is. But the importance of this difference in perceptions may have important real world outcomes. So in situations where people are interacting across group boundaries, Indigenous people feel less comfortable, and that might have a real impact on what those relationships feel like. Another way to think about this, again, is through those emoticons. And so essentially, if you want to summarize it, it is that both sides are feeling slightly better than ambivalent about mutually respectful relationships. And so there is much room for improvement before Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples value the relationship they have with each other, feel comfortable together, respect each other and each other's cultures, and trust one another. And then breaking this down, this overall score down into an average frequency, what that looks like is that 45% of non-Indigenous and 42% of Indigenous respondents agreed that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada have mutually respectful relationships. So certainly less than half. Now, for personal equality, in all ways, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous respondents disagreed that Indigenous peoples have equal outcomes. Indigenous, so you can see that this is true across, physical health, education, job and promotion, mental health, financial security. The pattern is very, very consistent. Indigenous respondents expressed the most concern about financial security, as well as mental health and job and promotion opportunities, and then education and physical health. However, Indigenous respondents were really similarly concerned about all these outcomes. So you can look at the size of the differences within a group, as well as the size of the differences between a group. And those differences within the Indigenous respondent sample were small. As well, Indigenous respondents agreed less than did non-Indigenous respondents that Indigenous peoples have good personal outcomes for all the statements. And this again represents a gap in understanding across the groups. And so in this case, our emoticons are unhappy and separated by a small distance. Finally, another way to interpret this score is that on average, 28% of non-Indigenous and 24% of Indigenous respondents agreed that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada have equal life outcomes. So if there is one point that you can take away from this talk, it is this one. As Ryan Moran, a co-investigator on this project, has said, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people live in a different Canada. It will take a great deal of time to resolve this. For engagement, the story is certainly different than personal equality. A bright spot is that Indigenous respondents somewhat agreed that they support Indigenous people's causes. That's here. Are learning about Indigenous peoples in Canada and their communities in their area, take part in Indigenous cultural events, and work with Indigenous peoples for justice. In contrast, non-Indigenous respondents only slightly agreed that they support Indigenous people's causes and are learning about Indigenous peoples in Canada as well as communities in their area. They also slightly disagreed that they participate in Indigenous cultural events and work with Indigenous peoples for justice. Even Indigenous peoples, however, are less likely to do these things, participate in cultural events and support justice. Notably, though, of all the statements in the survey, all the different indicators, the pattern of answers was least consistent for this one. So the biggest gaps between the groups were for participation, again, in cultural events and working with Indigenous peoples for justice. And the effect size of these differences is large. And so our emoticons in this case are a mixed pair of unhappy for the non-Indigenous sample and happy for the Indigenous sample, separated by a large distance. Again, converting the overall score to a frequency, we can say that on average, 34% of non-Indigenous and 67% of Indigenous respondents agreed they are interested in and support Indigenous causes and communities. To end on a happier note, here are the findings for Proud to be Indigenous. We simply asked respondents to rate the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with one statement, which we placed in the demographic section. It was, I am proud to be, and we auto-filled the end of this with what they indicated they identify with. So First Nations, Métis, or Inuk. And overwhelmingly, respondents agreed they are proud to be Indigenous. Across the country, 85% of respondents agreed that they are proud to be Indigenous. And this high level of agreement was consistent across all regions with some slight variation. The value ranged from 82 to 83% in Ontario, the Prairies, and the Atlantic, to 90 to 92% in British Columbia and Quebec. So that's unfortunately all the time I have today to present the results. And now Aleah and Iloradanon will describe our next steps and support.
All right. Thank you, Katherine. And again, if anybody has any questions at the end about any of the results, we're happy to answer them. So we wanted to end by speaking about what the next steps are for the project in both the short and the long term. So an initial, more immediate goal for us is to increase capacity for this project. So we're exploring different funding opportunities in order to bring on more personnel, as well as to expand our ability to report our findings. Another short-term goal of ours is to consider and potentially pilot new indicators for our 2023 report. So our initial conceptualization of reconciliation includes 13 indicators, but this conceptualization is ever evolving as our understanding of reconciliation continues to grow. So for example, one concept that we think might be missing from the current iteration of the barometer is accountability. Who is responsible for reconciliation? Are the parties and peoples who are responsible for many of the historical and ongoing harms being held accountable? We also hope that through reporting regularly on progress, particularly the areas that we're doing less well in and therefore need to pay special attention to, we might influence policy decision-making within government as well as within social systems. Another midterm goal of ours is to develop a platform to poll the same people over time, so a longitudinal sample. In order for us to do that, this will allow us to understand change within a group of people over time. And finally, we plan to build a knowledge exchange network through exploring ways our work might connect with others who are doing similar work in Canada as well as abroad, with the longer-term goal of building a comprehensive reporting system for reconciliation in Canada.
Great, thank you, Katherine and Aleah. Before ending our talk today, we want to say a big miigwech, marcy, hawa, or thank you to all of the people who made the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer possible. This includes the survivors whose statements we read, the focus group and interview participants who shared their knowledge, experiences, and expertise with us, our amazing team members, many of whom are not here today, including Rye Moran, Caitlin Newfield, Lorena Saquon Fontaine, Mary Agnes Welch, Aaron White, Kristen Smith, Jaden De La Rosa, and Brenda Gunn. We also want to thank every one of our supporters, that is, anyone who reached out to us over the years with comments and suggestions to help shape the project. And of course, research cannot happen without funders. So we want to thank our current and past funders and those who have provided in-kind support, including Shirk, Probe Research and MyTax, the Canadian Research Continuity Emergency Fund, the University of Psychology Department through their funding of our wonderful research assistant, and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So thank you so much for joining us today and listening, and we would love to open it up for questions and discussion at this point.
Okay, that is great. Thanks so much. Hugely interesting research. Maybe